The Seventh Tower by Garth Nix. Book 2, Castle. Chapter 15. Tal's first reaction to the pit was relief that it wasn't the Hall of Nightmares. As he'd been carried through the back corridors of the castle, he'd had plenty of time to imagine what the pit might be like. His mind had flooded with possibilities, like a pit filled with water, or he'd have to swim constantly to avoid drowning. But that would probably have been called a pool. So he started to think of things that might be kept in pits. A rogue spirit shadow, perhaps? The pit would have to be kept in total darkness, or lined with mirrors to hold the spirit shadow in there, but it was certainly possible. It was only since he had met the ice crawls that Tal had even considered the concept of a rogue spirit shadow. The idea had lingered like a dark seed in his brain, and it was now in full flower. He could imagine something uncurling in a dark corner, slowly reaching out to grab him while he lay tied up and unable to move. It would speak to him constantly, in a voice that would be the voice of the keeper from the Red Tower, high and horrible. By the time they actually got to the pit, Tal was sick with fear. He could barely breathe, and he had cramps in his stomach. His hands were twitching uncontrollably, like a light puppet performance gone wrong. When the spirit shadow unpeeled itself from his eyes, Tal had to call on all his courage to look at what was awaiting him. But the pit was just a pit. A circular shaft about 15 stretches in diameter, and maybe 30 stretches deep. There was no sign of anything waiting in it. But, as the spirit shadow stepped back from him, Tal had another awful second in which he imagined a previously unconsidered possibility. They were going to push him in, and he would break his legs and lie there in agony until he died. Instinctively, he looked for his shadow guard. It was still in the grip of the spirit shadow. The guards took a step forward. Tal gulped out of nervousness, stopping himself just in time to avoid swallowing the sunstone. But they didn't push him in. They stopped a few paces from him, with their spirit shadows between them, and raised their sunstones. Violet rays rushed out, forming one broad beam that wrapped itself around Tal. His own sunstone answered, so he had to quickly turn his head away from the guards to hide the light shining through his cheek and leaking through his tightly closed lips. The violet beam slowly took on a shape, turning into an enormous hand of light. It closed its fingers around Tal, and suddenly he was lifted into the air, his head almost smacking into the ceiling. The guards had created a hand of light. Tal knew it was possible, but he had never seen it in practice. It took several chosen of great skill and powerful sunstones acting together. Of course, the guards were all members of the Violet Order, and were therefore among the most proficient users of light magic in the castle. "Time for a little dance?" asked one guard, and the others laughed. The hand immediately shook Tal from side to side, and then up and down until he felt sick. Because he had the sunstone in his mouth, Tal couldn't scream or beg for mercy. This made the game boring for the guards, who soon lost interest. The hand stopped its wild movements and quickly lowered Tal down to the bottom of the pit. It let him go there, hovered just above his head, and waved its luminous fingers in farewell, accompanied by more laughter from the guards. Then it shrank away into nothing, as the four chosen ceased concentrating on their sunstones. As the hand disappeared, so did the light. Tal was left in semi-darkness. The room above the pit was lit by sunstones, but very little of their light came down to the deep hole to Tal. He was tempted to use his own stone, but there was a chance the guards hadn't gone very far. They would take it from him if it was discovered. He could still see enough to explore what little there was at the bottom of the pit. He was glad to see a moldy but serviceable mattress against one wall, and even more pleased to find that there was a small pool of water, fed by a pipe. On the other side of the pit there was a primitive toilet, just a narrow sewer that went straight down. It was too narrow to escape through, even if he could stand it. There was also a basket in the corner, with half a very stale loaf of bread in it. Tal took this as sign that food would probably be provided. He sat down on the mattress and spat the sunstone into his hand. Then he slipped it into his sleeve pocket. He was still wearing his ice-carl furs, though his big outer coat had been left at the entrance to the heatway tunnels. Even the inner furs were too warm, quite smelly, and uncomfortable. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Tal sat and thought about his situation. He was well aware that he had done things that were not the actions of a proper chosen. But even though he had probably broken a dozen laws, he wasn't supposed to be punished like this. According to what he'd learned in the lectorium, a chosen couldn't be taken to a place like the Hall of Nightmares until they'd had a trial, and even after that they can appeal to the Assembly of the Chosen, or to the Empress. He should have been brought before the Luminor of the Orange Order first, and then been tried in the Old Court. He should have a speaker for the accused, an older chosen with an interest in law, to represent him. What was going on? Tal sighed and bent his head. There were too many problems confronting him. He still hadn't seen his mother, let alone helped her. Gref was lost, Kusi was in the clutches of the ghastly cousins, and Mila was in the Hall of Nightmares. She wouldn't even know what was going to happen to her there. Unlike Tal, who had heard awful stories about the Hall of Nightmares all his life, it was the worst punishment he could imagine. Spirit shadows would enter Mila's dreams. They would change them into nightmares, nightmares that she would be unable to escape. She wouldn't be able to wake up until they let her. Tal had seen what the Hall of Nightmares did to rebellious underfolk. For years, the same man had worked in the main passage outside Tal's family chambers. He was a sweeper and a cleaner. One day, he started throwing soapy water at passing chosen. Then the actual buckets, and a half-bright was knocked unconscious. The underfolk was taken away to the Hall of Nightmares. When he came back, he shook and shivered for weeks, and no longer smiled as the chosen children played their games with light and shadow in the hallways. He was one of the lucky ones. Some never came back at all. Tal didn't want to see Mila like that, which meant that he had to rescue her. Then find the Codex so he could find Gref, then get his mother to Ionir so she could be cured, then clear his name so he could become a proper chosen, and then find a sunstone for the Far Raiders, as he'd promised. "One step at a time," Tal whispered. His father had always said that when Tal complained about everything he had to do. He suddenly remembered his father and mother helping Kusi to walk for the first time. They had stood on either side of the smiling baby, holding her hands, with Gref and Tal walking backward in front of her. "One step at a time," they'd all chanted. And Kusi had taken her first step, and then another, and another. Tal's first step had to be to get out of the pit. He couldn't do anything from a hole in the ground. He looked at the triple scar on his wrist, where he had been marked by the crone. Something of the Icecarls must have gotten into him. Like the Icecarls, and the Selski they followed, Tal knew that if he stopped, he would die. Having made the decision to escape, Tal put on the sunstone ring, turning the stone inward so he could shield it with his hand. Then he called forth a very faint light, and used it to search around the sides of the pit. He had learned to climb well on the mountain of light. If there were any cracks in the wall, he might be able to climb up, using them as toe and finger holds. But the walls were smooth and seamless. By the time Tal had been halfway around, he knew it was useless. The pit hadn't been dug with normal tools, but cut through solid rock with light, probably by chosen using sunstones. The walls were as smooth as glass, the rock actually fused. He was about to give up when he noticed a small rough patch right at eye level. Nothing that would help him climb, but Tal rushed over for a closer look anyway. The roughness was not an accident. Someone had scratched letters and numbers into the rock. Several different people, Tal thought, from the variations in handwriting. Some scratches were faded and clearly very old. Some were obviously fresher. There were fragments of names and tally marks that probably counted meals, for there would be no other way of keeping time. Unlike the Icecarls, Chosen did not care to count every breath, unconsciously or otherwise. There had been prisoners who had spent months here, or even years. Was there any way to escape?